you are a former detective or policeman, is that correct?
I am, yes.
How long were you a policeman for, Tim?
About 9 years.
Okay, and then you quit to do what? Become a private detective, investigator?
Not explicitly. I went travelling for a bit, but I left the police in 2005, and by 2009, after a bit of travel and a few other bits and pieces, I ended up setting up my own, or joining a business partner actually, and setting up Zavesta, an investigation company.
Okay. And that's a well-established path of a number of ex-police. So how on earth in 2009 do you stray across the Gail Maney case?
So, well, I guess there's a bit of history. Gail's case came to my attention in 2018 when the Gone Fishing podcast was produced and published by journalists Adam Dudding and Amy Maas, and they asked me to have a look and provide some brief comment based on my earlier miscarriage of justice work on other cases. And so it was on the basis of that podcast and what I read about the case then that I became interested in it.
Right, so in actual fact, you became interested listening to the media podcast of Gone Fishing. That's remarkable. And you contact them, and then they say to you what? Can you help us check some things out?
They wanted some commentary from somebody that had worked on previous miscarriage of justice cases, and they got commentary from others as well. And so that was how I was introduced to it, and as part of that, I ended up being introduced by Amy and Adam to Gail Maney herself.
Right. Now, Gail Maney, I presume she was, as I said, convicted in 1999. There was another trial in 2000. She was convicted there. She served time in prison, I imagine, and she's been released on parole since.
That's right. Gail's done a total of 16 years in prison, and her co-accused, Stephen Stone, has done 26 years and counting. He remains in prison, and Mark Henriksen was sentenced to about 3 years in prison as an accessory after the fact as well.
Okay, you've investigated the Gail Maney case. Being a former policeman, obviously that would assist you. Can I take you back to before you take on this case to do with Gail Maney, though? Was it your perception in your time in the police that the police did make mistakes when it came to murder and in criminal investigations, or that they were pretty much the person that was sitting in the dock was the person who should be there?
Well, early in my career, I didn't sort of give those sort of thoughts too much of my time, but in around 2000, when Taina Porter was facing his second trial, I'd heard some discussion amongst some senior detectives about the fact whether that might have been a miscarriage of justice. And so that was, I guess, my first introduction to those types of ideas. I have to say that in my time in the police, I saw very little in the way of corrupt activity or deliberate targeting of people that hadn't committed crimes. So it wasn't something that was at the forefront of my mind at the time. As the years have gone on, I've worked on a few cases and see things a little bit differently now.
Yes, because you did work on the Taina Porter case. I understand you also were central or a lead participant in establishing the innocence of Allan Hall, the fisherman who was convicted of murder. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, Allan, yes. And that was another case that I got involved in on the back of a very good podcast by Mike Wesley-Smith.
Right. Now, he was wrongfully convicted of murdering Arthur Easton, I think in 1985. It's been described as one of New Zealand's worst miscarriages of justice, and the government agreed to pay him out $5 million last year in compensation, which I think is the largest payout for wrongful conviction in New Zealand history. What was your role in that particular issue?
I was, I guess, for lack of a better term, the lead investigator in that case as well. So I worked with his legal team. Nick Chisnell, KC, led that team, and Katja Paquin, and we took that case to the Supreme Court a couple of years ago.
You did, and it was overturned, and there was an acceptance that a substantial miscarriage of justice had occurred. Can I just explain, though, to listeners right now, Tim? People, you might remember that case. It was about a man by the name of Arthur Easton. He was at home, as I remember. He was attacked by an intruder in the early hours of the morning, I think, and so were his two teenage sons. They were attacked in their house by a man apparently carrying a Swiss bayonet. All three of them were stabbed. Arthur Easton was killed. The intruder was described by Easton's sons and other witnesses as Maori, 6'2" and tall and strong. But Allan Hall, the man that was convicted for his murder, was a 5'7", slightly built asthmatic Pākehā. Can you tell me, before we go on to Gail, that case, how could something so clearly, obviously, that the wrong man's there, have transpired that Allan Hall did end up getting convicted of that murder?
Yeah, the answer is probably too lengthy for this interview, but there were a series of what could be best described as entirely inappropriate and questionable inquiries and tactics engaged by the police at the time to secure the evidence that they used to prosecute Allan. It is a terrible case, and one that should never have taken as long as it did to be overturned.
Well, and that's the other thing here, because it seems, when you look at it from an outside perspective, and you've looked at it from an inside perspective, it seems to be the miscarriage of justice you've suggested. It took so long until, I think, March of 2022 before he was released from prison. Gail Maney, are you suggesting is a similar case where it is so obvious that Gail Maney did not do it or was not involved?
Yeah, I need to be careful to differentiate between my opinion and sort of not try and sidestep the importance that the court role plays here. But my view is undoubtedly that Gail, Stephen Stone, and Mark Henriksen are all entirely innocent, and that the offences for which they were charged, tried and convicted were a fantastical series of stories that were, put simply, not true.
Who made up the stories?
Very good question. So my view is there needs to be an inquiry into how this was able to happen. We have a theory on how that was able to happen, but it's undoubtedly true that there were 4 witnesses that claimed that these events happened, 2 separate murders in the course of a week. 2 of those 4 witnesses have since come forward bravely, in my view, and said that none of it was true and that they were simply reciting a story that the police had given them.
And what about the other 2 witnesses?
They didn't tell a linear story about these events, and we've got very serious questions about how they came to tell the story. And I don't want to preempt the appeal by getting into that in too much detail.
I understand. Yeah. Okay. So because and yesterday, as I understand, the police, or at least the Crown persons representing the Crown in this particular matter, have admitted that, the Crown have admitted, quoting Radio New Zealand here, that there was a miscarriage of justice in the trials. Now, they're not saying that Gail Maney and Stephen Stone weren't innocent, but what they're saying is that the trials of Gail Maney and Stephen Stone included a couple of events. Could you explain those 2 events that led them to this view, that the trials were unfair?
Again, it's probably I need to be cautious about what I say in advance of the appeal, but simply put, I can confirm that the Crown's position is that both trials miscarried, and it is now a question for the appellate court as to what to do about that and what the appropriate outcome is. But you're quite right in your suggestion that's not a statement from the Crown of innocence. It is simply stating that the trial's miscarried and that that needs to be dealt with by the court.